From the year 2000 to 2014, over 4,000 games were released on the PlayStation 2. Widely considered as one if not the most popular console ever released, it gave birth to an amazing library of games, spanning through genres with many classics, underrated gems, shovelware, and strange and forgotten titles. My goal here is to play and review each and every single game released on the console in a somewhat chronological manner, creating the ultimate retrospective of my favorite video game console. There are going to be a few rules in place. Number 1, only the original release date will be taken into account. Number 2, even if the game released on other platforms, we'll only review the PS2 versions. Number 3, games that are very similar will sometimes be combined into a single video, even if their release date is a few months apart. Number 4, and lastly, I unfortunately can't read Japanese, so games that weren't translated in English and where you need to understand the language to play won't be reviewed, but only mentioned. Will we succeed at covering it all? Probably not. But we won't find out until we deep dive into our very next game. Welcome to PS2 UR, the PlayStation 2 Ultimate Retrospective. After getting started with the slog that was Atron 6, let's go with something that does a bit more justice to the PS2, with probably one of the most interesting games coming from the launch of the console. This time releasing as a launch title in all regions, Kessen is a strategy game developed by Koei, well known for making some very well regarded historical strategy games, with titles like Romance of the Three Kingdoms, Liberty or Death, Nobunaga's Ambition, Genghis Khan, or even PTO, Pacific Theater of Operation, just to name a few. Kessen is in the same vein, retracing the events of the conflict between the Tokugawas and the Toyotomis in Japan during the very beginning of the 17th century, emphasizing some key points of the conflict, most notably the Sekigahara Battle of 1600. If that topic can seem a bit complex at first, especially if Japanese history isn't your thing, the game actually takes time to explain the ins and outs of what's going on through cutscenes and briefings. Lots of cutscenes and briefings, clearly showing some passion about Japanese history, and how the developers tried as hard as they could to represent this conflict as best as possible with the PS2's limitations. You can even see that right before you start a new game, with a message from the game's producer, Kurosawa, expressing his will to create an interactive movie of the Sekigahara battle, reflecting how Kessen seeks not only to show off the PlayStation 2's capabilities, but also to be an edutainment title, which I can only respect. I should just point out for all the Japanese history nuts out there, that this game is more based on the novelization of the events, published in 1966 and written by Ryotaro Shiba. It's still faithful to the actual events for what I've seen, but there are still some minor differences, notably the assassination of Masayuki Sanada ordered by Hide Tokugawa, a major plot point of the Eastern Army campaign. That same novel also inspired the 2017 film Sekigahara, which I would recommend if that topic piques your interest. Just be aware that the movie doesn't take its time to explain who the characters are, it just expects you to have some knowledge of the events beforehand. Speaking of films, the presentation of the game is by far its biggest strength, being full of cutscenes before, after, and even during battles. Right in the beginning, the game greets you with an epic intro that gives you a taste of what the game is like, and it does a pretty good job at that. Kessen embraces its influences from Japan's samurai films, more notably from the 50s and 60s, popularized through the works of Akira Kurosawa, Masaki Kobayashi, and Kihachi Okamoto, all immensely influential filmmakers that I can only recommend. Drawn out tangents aside, the game begins through a tutorial level, already a way better way to start than everything that happened in Atron 6. Unfortunately, it's not great. The game info dumps you every single order's mechanics or maneuvers for 10 minutes, without really showing how anything should be used. It really just feels like a modern mobile game tutorial where you are instructed to click on things without understanding how it works. Here, you just follow orders without explanations on what those entails and why you should proceed that way. Thankfully, Kessen is far from being as in-depth or complex as other Koei strategy games. You'll quickly get the hang of it after a battle or two. Once the tutorial over, and a few cutscenes later, you get into the politics and preparations phase of the game to get ready for the start of the show, the Sekigahara battle. Once again, the game gives you a tutorial, this time being way better explained than the previous one. During that part, you'll have to choose your generals, modify your units, and try to bribe opposing generals to make the next battle easier. This is the biggest letdown of the game. Although it's conceptually a very interesting mechanic that could add a lot of strategic decision making into the game, you don't actually get any choice at all. The game selects for you the targeted generals. Quite the missed opportunity there, to be honest. I should also mention that the game lets you choose between two campaigns, either with the Eastern Army, represented by Hideki Tokugawa, or with the Western Army, represented by Mitsunari Ishida. Both not only portray two different stories playing out, but also two difficulty levels. The Eastern campaign, which is the historically accurate one, is far easier, encouraging a very aggressive playstyle. Just spam special maneuvers over and over again and you'll eventually get to the end of the game, without much of an issue. The Western campaign conversely is more difficult, thanks to the troops being weaker, less responsive to your orders, and with more complex win conditions to win battles. When the politics and preparations are done, you get into the council, where you can analyze the battlefield and revise your strategy. It's not required to do, as the game automatically decides for a strategy that is completely serviceable if you want to win the game. Now is, I think, a good time to talk about another flaw of the game, the large difference in quality between the two campaigns. It's abundantly clear that the East got way more care and thought put into the campaign than the West. The Eastern Army has more fleshed out characters with well-defined personalities and motivations, whereas the Western generals are mostly one note, stakes doesn't feel as high, and even the cutscene directing feels flatter in the Western campaign, surprisingly enough. Just to give an idea what I mean, let's compare how the cutscenes play out in both campaigns right before Sekigahara. Beginning with the West, right after the preparations, you get into the dramatic entrance of Commander Naomasa Yi at the Eastern Camp during a foggy night dimly lit through torches. Naomasa announces to the council that Ishida has been seen heading to Sekigahara. Over-the-top zoom with intense blur to show Tokugawa's shock, followed by a brief mention of Ichida's right-hand man, Sakon Shima. Then there is a flashback of a previous confrontation between Shima and Tokugawa. Right after that, Tokugawa asks about his son and learns he won't be here for the big battle. Then he looks into eastern flags blowing in the wind, cutting into a debate between the commanders about who shall attack Ishida first and their reasons why. Masanori Fukushima begins by sharing his hatred against Ishida, mentioning that he stole from the Toyotomi family and what happened during the raid of Fushimi Castle. Next is Naga Kuroda, adding his sentiments toward Ishida before being interrupted by Commander Osokawa, who proclaims that Naga's father is plotting to take control of the Kyushu region behind Tokugawa's back. Then Osokawa shares his motivations. His objective is to avenge his wife, who was killed during a raid at his mansion perpetrated by Ishida. This narrative differs from what historical facts suggest. Ishida captured Osokawa's wife to make her his, but she refused and decided to kill herself instead, for the sake of staying loyal to her husband. Finally, you get a shot of Tokugawa looking imposing while all the generals shout his name. After the council, you get another cutscene of Tokugawa having a vision of Lord Nobunaga in the sky. Tokugawa gives himself a motivational speech to hype himself up, raises his sword, and cuts through the mist, revealing his army. It's definitely a lot to take in, but the game does that at a moderate pace, giving you just enough to soak up everything in a span of about 7 minutes of cutscenes. The West gets just over 4 minutes in comparison. First with a conversation between Ishida and Sakon Shima regarding the upcoming fight. Then the same flashback of Shima confronting Tokugawa plays in an extended form. Following up is a conversation between two generals, Shimatsu and Otani, debating about Ishida's methods. During that conversation, the same bit about Naga's father scheming to take Kyushu plays. The council is about to start as we see Officer Kikawa and Lord Kobayakawa. This is the most visually interesting cutscene of the bunch as it takes Kobayakawa's point of view, using more erratic camera movements, first-person perspective, and detailed facial expressions, all to represent Kobayakawa's nervousness and confusion. Sakon Shima warns Ishida that Kikawa and Kobayakawa might betray him during the fight, but Ishida just replies back with, "Nah, they won't," and laughs it out. Ironically, Kikawa does betray Ishida during Sekigahara, and Kobayakawa will join whatever army you're playing as. After the council, you get a very brief cutscene of Ishida looking pretty goofy in my opinion, stating that he's going to win the battle. Not quite as impactful as Tokugawa's vision and speech, to be honest. I obviously won't dissect every cutscene of the game, we would be there for hours if so, but I think you get where I was going through. Ishida's campaign feels like it lacks emotional investment. Maybe it's just a personal preference, but that's how I felt through playing with the Western Army. Back to focusing on the game now. Sekigahara being the very first level you play besides the tutorial is a pretty interesting choice from a game design perspective. Other than being the most famous battle of the represented era, it's also one of the longest battles in the game. It almost feels like it would have been more fitting as a final stage rather than in the very beginning of the game, but it does work remarkably well, giving you enough time to get used to the gameplay and the flow of the game. And even if you don't get used to it at this point, you can actually lose this battle and get into a different route for your campaign. Because yes, this game also includes branching paths for some reason, and I just love it. As previously mentioned, the gameplay here is quite simple, simplistic even. You mostly have 3 different orders you can give to your troops: attacking, resting, and special maneuvers. These special maneuvers are essentially special attacks that can deal significant damage, to the point of being able to turn the outcome of the battle around. They consume a resource called Zeal that you either gradually get during the battle or when you accomplish some actions, mostly when you eliminate opposing generals. Troops efficiency is also determined through a moral gauge. The lower the moral, the worse they perform, so you'll need to rest your troops to replenish some of it. The rest of the time, when you're not spamming maneuvers, the game basically is just clashing big numbers into each other until the biggest number wins. All served through impressive graphics for the time that perfectly manages to represent massive battles. The in-game battles are filled with flash animations, amplifying furthermore the cinematic feel of the game, maybe to a fault? I can't argue that I spent more time watching Kessen rather than actually playing it. The game has a ton of animations to show off, and will definitely do again and again. Thankfully you can just skip them, which does help out speeding out the pace of the game, although it remains quite slow overall. Not to the game's dismay though, it's still a genuinely good and enjoyable title, mainly for its narrative, but the gameplay is also quite gripping when the battles get intense. It certainly won't get any awards for being the best game on the console, but it's undeniably a great launch title that perfectly managed to show off the PS2 hardware. The rest of the game pretty much goes as you would expect. The cutscene explains what's going on. Optionally, depending on the levels, you'll get into the preparations and politics phase, then you go into the council, get another cutscene, and then the next battle starts. Objectives are all very similar and offer little variety, but the game is short enough that it doesn't come as a big issue. with only 6 battles per campaign, including the tutorial. It's clear that Kessen never tried to be a complex, groundbreaking strategy game that would shatter the video game industry. It's undoubtedly a passion project from Kihachi Okumoto that managed to recreate as, for lack of a better term, cinematically as possible this famous conflict that would change Japan forever, but as a video game. Not only through the numerous cutscenes, but also thanks to a quite robust dictionary containing bios and infos about every major character in the game. It even contains family trees for each of them. That's such an unnecessary yet charming feature that I just can't help myself but to feel sympathy towards the game and the devs that worked behind it. Without a doubt, the game won't be for everyone, for all the previously mentioned reasons. However, for those who'll check it out, you'll see that Kessen oozes with style and charm. It should be pointed out that Kessen received 2 sequels, one in 2001 and the other in late 2004, apparently shifting quite considerably from the tone of the first game from what I've briefly seen. Hopefully we'll get to review them at some point. Until then, take care of yourself and see you soon.
Take this!